So thank you everybody for coming today to this LIANZA webinar. It's my great pleasure to introduce Theresa Buller. She is currently the Subject Librarian for Law and Criminal Justice at the University of Canterbury, and she is the former, or I think the NZLA immediate past president. And so we're very lucky and to have her here today to share some information with you that hopefully will be really useful and interesting for you wherever it is that you work across the library and information sector. So Theresa, I will invite you to take it away. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna, and thank you so much everybody for coming along today. I see a few familiar names and faces, so thank you for coming. So my goal today really was to talk about an introduction to legal research and really show you how to find free legal sources in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So a little bit about me, so you know who I am and that I can talk about this stuff. I'm a subject librarian for law and criminal justice here at UC. My role really is about teaching legal research skills every day. I'm super passionate about ensuring that our students have the skills they need to be successful in their study. And part of that is about knowing where to find sources and how to find them. I'm also the immediate past president of the NZLLA, and I am doing my LLB very, very part-time so that I can understand the student experience. One thing I have learned is that contract law is not my fave, but we'll see how I got on this year. Way too many screens open here. All right, I made this presentation in Canva for the first time, and I'm learning my way around navigating Canva presenting. So my plan for today's webinar really is to talk about legal information. You might sometimes hear cynical law librarians say law is special, and in many ways law is special because legal information is different from any other kind of information, and the way that lawyers use legal information is a little bit different. There's also the terminology, libraries are the lawyers' laboratories, and in academia that's incredibly true because our students use the library really to find out about the law, understand what the law is, and how people can find it. So we'll talk about legal information, and I'll talk about some of the terms that get used so you know if someone asks you for something, what you're actually looking for. I'm going to show you how to find legal resources online. The reason I'm choosing really to show you how to find free material online is because there's a lot of material in the public domain that you can access without a subscription. And then also I will make sure that there's lots of time for questions. So please put your questions in the chat or ask as we go along. I'll hold them all until the end, and then I'm happy to answer questions about legal research, legal information, or just about what I do every day if you're curious about me as a law librarian. So let's start with what is legal information. So legal information can really be divided into two categories. So really there's the law itself. So the things that tell us what the law is, and they're known as primary material. Sometimes primary sources, I normally call them primary material, and that's legislation and cases. So legislation is the law created by Parliament or under the authority of an act. With the Legislation Act 2019, everything made that's not called a statute or an act is called secondary legislation. And there are things like legislative instruments and statutory regulations. So I tend to use the three terms legislation, statutes, and acts pretty interchangeably to mean an act of Parliament. So something that Parliament, so the House of Representatives and the Governor General have said, this is the law in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then secondary legislation, I tend to call it legislative instruments or statutory regulations, depending on which one it is. In terms of what they are, so legislation, statute, acts is the act, which tells us what the law is. Secondary legislation, I always think of it as it's the way it tells you that the act's going to work. So, for example, we have a statute that says parents in Aotearoa will be paid parental leave by the government for a certain period of time. But then there's a legislative instrument every year that says, actually, the rate of paid parental leave is going to be however much it is each year, okay? So sometimes the secondary legislation is a bit more specific than the legislation itself. And then there are cases. So cases are the decisions of a court, tribunal, or authority. So I tend to use the terms cases, judgments, and judicial decisions pretty interchangeably, really meaning a decision made by a judge or judges, or if we're going to be really specific, a tribunal, authority member, etc. Really saying this is the decision based on the law and the facts of the case, and this is my decision. And both of those things, so legislation and cases, are primary sources that tell us what the law is. So the courts use precedent to tell us, the courts use precedent to make sure that cases are decided in the same way using the law from Parliament as well. Oh, hold on, I've gone too far. Yeah, what I didn't, so primary sources, secondary sources then are about the law. And I've realized I've managed to miss a slide in my prep here, but secondary sources are things like books and journal articles and legal encyclopedias, all things where people tell us about the law. And you might have some of those in your library collection. Law is well known for giant big treatises, so huge big thick books on tiny little thin bindable paper, where someone, usually an academic, sometimes a judge, they write everything they know about a legal topic. And we can use those books and journal articles to understand what people think about the law, how they interpret the law, or they might say, well, the statute says this, and then these cases have agreed, so this is how we know what the law is as well. So now that we've had now that I've talked about what kind of legal sources there are, I really wanted to put a disclaimer before I started showing you how to find legal material. And I know this is one of the things when I used to work at a public library that I found the hardest, is that while we might have legal sources and legal information in our collections and accessible to us online, as librarians and library assistants and legal information professionals, we actually can't give legal advice. We can't give legal advice because the law tells us, so a statute tells us that we can't give an advice. So the Lawyers and Conveyancers Act, Section 21, subsection 1, subsection A, says a person commits an offence who, not being a lawyer or an incorporated law firm, provides legal services in New Zealand. That sounds pretty broad, but then the definition within that same statute, Section 6, subsection B says advice in relation to any legal or equitable rights or obligations. So really, I just want to make clear that we can't give legal advice. And really, if you get asked a question about the law or legal advice, you are able to show people how to find the source itself, but can't give them any advice on that at all. It's one line that I was always, I found really hard for a long time, and then it became easier because I was able to say, well, actually, I can show you how to find the statute or the case, but you will need to read it yourself, or you will actually need to talk to a lawyer. And community law is an amazing resource we have in Aotearoa, and they would be the people that I would refer people to. So a lawyer and or community law as well. So let's now have a look at how you can find legal information in Aotearoa for free. I know many of you might have subscriptions to the paid legal databases. I'm purposely chosen not to show you those today, really because there's lots that's available for free, and I feel that for most legal queries that you might get in a library, and really, I will be honest, I've pitched this at public librarians, although I know I see that there are many colleagues from law firms and other places in Aotearoa on the call. Yeah, that's why I'm showing you 3 things. So in terms of legislation, our amazing colleagues at the Parliamentary Council Office have a website called legislationgovnz. Everything I show you today, you can just Google really easily and it should be the first thing that comes up. But I will also, when we put the video up, maybe Anna, we can put the links in the chat or something. Not quite sure how we're going to do that, but we will get the links to you. So legislation.gov.nz is free, obviously, and it is hosted and maintained by the Parliamentary Council Office. So the Parliamentary Council Office, their role really, from my perspective, they're responsible for writing nearly all of New Zealand legislation, and they also have a role in making it accessible. So once upon a time, libraries had volumes and volumes of print legislation. We still do at the university, and I know some public libraries do, but more and more legal research can be done online. So if someone asks you how to find an act or a statute, legislation.gov.nz is the place to go. It is really, really easy to use. If you know the name of the act, you can just do a quick search. And the example I've chosen is the Care of Children Act 2004. And it's just a matter of typing the name in the act. And normally as I type, I will get the drop-down menu and I can click on the title of my act, scroll down, and I get the act itself. So one of the reasons I love legislation.gov.nz is that as I scroll down, I can see the sections of my statute. So every act is structured with sections, and in legislation.gov.nz, there is a hyperlink to each one. So section 4 of the Care of Children Act 2004 tells me child's welfare and best interest to be paramount. And if I click on that link, I can scroll down and read that particular section. Legislation.gov.nz is amazing in that if within the statute there is reference to another section or another act or a piece of secondary legislation, there will be a link. So for this one, it tells me that for section 4, we also need to look at section 5. So let me click on that link and then it will take me to section 5. Legislation.gov.nz is really easy to navigate. There you can navigate between the sections. I can also read the act in its entirety by clicking on View Whole and then just scrolling my way through it. And if I go back up to the top, I can also see each version and amendment. Now legislation.gov.nz has been around since 2006, 2007. So I can see every version at a particular point in time. So law is also a little bit different because depending on what's going on, you might need to see what the law was at a particular point in time. And when that happens, we could go back and see what the Care of Children Act said at particular dates. And the reason there are different versions is because changes have been made to the statute. So often it's that Parliament will have made a change and those changes will be incorporated. So let me scroll up and we can see that the latest version is at the 28th of October, but that there are some updates up the top that aren't yet in force. And when they are, there'll be a new version. I mentioned that secondary legislation is really the specifics. So rather than broadly, this is the law, secondary legislation might tell you some really specific information. As I said, my paid parental leave example, it's always good because it tells me the amount of paid parental leave in the secondary legislation. But we can see here, when I've clicked on the secondary legislation link, that under this Act, there are some rules, some regulations, etc. All things that give more specificity to the Act, really, is how I always like to think of them. Okay? So sometimes you might get a really broad question. I want to see what the law is on this particular Act. Or someone might say, actually, I need to see what a particular section of a statute says. So each Act has specific sections. In a really simple way, they're like a chapter of an Act, but all sections. And if I need to search for a particular section, I can click on Advanced Search, enter the title of the Act I'm looking for, so Crimes Act 1961, and then the section number is section 92, okay, is the one I'm looking for, I'm going to use for my example. So my hope is that if you need to search for a section, it's because you've been asked for it, or you might have a reference that says section 92. And I'll put in the chat what that might look like if it was written down. So Crimes Act 1961. Okay. So written down, a citation for a section might look like this. And then if I click on search, I can see that my search results tell me Crimes Act 1961. And let me click on that link. And it should take me to section 92, which tells me that piracy by the law of nations is a crime, okay, in the Crimes Act. So legislation can be really big. And if someone asks you for a specific section, you can search just by browse and then identifying the section as well. Okay. So that's legislation. One thing I know, legislation.gov.nz is free. It doesn't have any links to any cases or commentary or journal articles or any of those secondary sources that talk about the law that you might get in a paid subscription database. But it is really, really good at telling you exactly what the law is, ensuring that it is absolutely correct and up to date. Under the versions and amendments tab, I also have the option to print or download a PDF. And once I download that PDF, I get a PDF document. But the really key thing about the PDF is that I get the coat of arms on it. So the coat of arms tells me that it is an official version. And the fact that it is an official version gives me confidence that it tells me exactly what the law is at a particular point in time. Okay. So that's how to find legislation. You can also do the same search to search for secondary legislation. So under advanced search, I could choose secondary legislation. And this is where I could look for my paid parental leave, but I don't actually know what the name of the Act is. I just talk about it all the time. So that's okay. I could do my search there. Okay. So that's legislation. The next thing I said that I was going to show you was how to find a case. So, and then present. I just want to plug Canva in terms of being able to make PowerPoints. It was super easy and really fun to use Canva to make the PowerPoint for this one today, and they're not paying me to say that. So cases, as I mentioned earlier, are decisions of the courts, tribunals and authorities. So in terms of resolving a case, if it is a case which has been heard by a judge or a tribunal or authority, there should generally be a decision. Sometimes in terms of finding it, they're really difficult. Sometimes cases are suppressed, so they're never made publicly accessible. If it's a jury trial, there will never be a court decision unless there is a sentencing, and then the judge will make a decision. But generally, for most run-of-the-mill things, most of the time, you might be able to find a decision available online. And there are two places where you can find material. One is through our very own Ministry of Justice, and one is through NZLA. So I will show you both of those now. Actually, sorry, I've put the wrong link out. I've gone to the wrong link in preparing. This is the link I've put in the PowerPoint. So the Ministry of Justice release some judgments through their website. And from here, on this page, so Courts of New Zealand /judgment, they list some of the ways that you can access judgments from the court. And you might get a question from someone. A recent example might be someone saying, I actually want to read the decision about the Peter Ellis case. Peter Ellis had a long and fraught journey through our court system, and ultimately the Supreme Court has quashed his conviction. And it's also, from an academic point of view, been incredibly interesting because the court has talked about tikanga, and it's going to have a huge impact on the law in terms of acknowledging that New Zealand has a bicultural, bijural, and bilingual legal system. I know for me as a law librarian, it's been really interesting to follow along the Peter Ellis case. However, for you, you might be asked, how can I find the Peter Ellis case? So I would come to this website and then look at judicial decisions online. And from here, actually it's up the top, I can click on search. Search for Alice. And then I get so many results, right? 2,000 results. I think it is because every single one of these cases might either mention Peter Ellis or a judge named Alice or someone else named Alice. So let me go back a step and redo my search for Alice, but limit it down to the Supreme Court. So in your reference interview, might be super helpful to get as much information out of your client as possible to find out exactly what they're looking for, so you can narrow your search down. Supreme Court, Alice. Let me click on search. This time I get 150 results. And then as I scroll down, I can see that there are 2 for Peter Ellis and the Queen. Now, one of the things today I purposely chose not to talk about was legal citation. In New Zealand, we use the New Zealand Law Style Guide. One of the reasons I purposely chose not to talk about legal citation is because it gets complicated incredibly quickly, and I felt that I could devote a whole hour to talking about legal citation. And I thought that if I showed you how to use databases using the information you might get from your clients and users without worrying about citation, it would help you to be able to answer the bulk of your questions. However, if there's interest in a session on legal citation, let me know, because I can talk about the Law Style Guide for Alice. So Alice and the Queen, I could click on either of these links. There were 2 separate decisions for Alice. And if I click on that one, I get a PDF and a copy of the decision as well. Okay, so freely available online through the courts, a decision that I've been able to search for just for one party name. So in terms of courts, there's a defendant and a plaintiff, and they are each called party as well. Okay. So the Ministry of Justice is really good. I like, if I go back to the page I was on, this one here, which is called the Decisions of Public Interest page, in terms of being able to access everything from the Supreme Court. Most stuff from the Court of Appeal and the High Court can be accessed here. There are also decisions from the District Court and some other ministry ones as well. There is a big disclaimer, though, that the Ministry of Justice are incredibly hardworking, but not every decision is released to the public. So sometimes you can't find them on the ministry site. And another place you can have a look is the New Zealand Legal Information Institute. And gratefully, the MOJ have a link on this page as well. You can also Google New Zealand Legal Information Institute, or NZLA as it is known for short, and that's the link I've put on my PowerPoint. So I love NZLA. I have a vested interest because I have been involved in doing some work with them. The New Zealand Legal Information Institute is a completely free database of New Zealand legal information. So not just cases, not just judgments, but there are also statutes and acts. There's also historic information. There is also some law journals, so some secondary sources. There's also some historic legal material that hasn't been digitized anywhere else. NZLA is part of the LI movement. So the LI's been the Legal Information Institute, and the LIs around the world really work to make material accessible to the public for free. What that means though is that it is quite a simple system. NZLA runs on donations and limited funding, and do an absolutely amazing job with the resources they have. Also a plug, if you're in a position to contribute to NZLA, I know they would be incredibly grateful. So there are a couple of ways I can use NZLA to find legal information. If I am looking for a case, I can click on the left-hand side under case law, and then identify the court for the case that I'm looking for. So I'd said that the MOJ, you can find some material on their website, and really the MOJ is great for the higher court, so High Court, Court of Appeal, Supreme Court, really the courts that have the biggest impact in Aotearoa. But NZLA has a big long list of lots and lots of different courts and tribunals and authorities, and with decisions, not a complete set over time, but with decisions from some of these courts. So I was going to show you, you can see where I've pre-prepared today, the High Court of New Zealand. So let me click on the High Court and then choose a particular year. I chose 2018. And then the case I've chosen to show you is the Kennel Club. So in terms of answering a question, if you were to know, for example, I knew I'm looking for a case that was in the High Court for a particular year, I would navigate in exactly the same way that I've shown you. Identify the court on NZLA, the year, and then either scroll through or do a Control F search and look for it. And then I would find my case. So this one here is about the registration of some dogs as well. So I thought that was quite interesting to show you. However, I can search NZLA. So for example, if I go back to the home page, and then I had someone come to me and said, look, I know there was a case. It was about someone I know, and I know that their surname's Luoni. I'm using Luoni as it's my maiden name. I could search NZLA to see if there were any cases or any material that comes up with my name in it as well. And you can see that there are a few. There's a few where Luoni is in the hyperlink, which tells me that there was somebody named Luoni who was a party to the case. And then there's a percentage of how much it matches my search terms. But also as I scroll down, that percentage gets less. I think that's because somewhere in those decisions, my Luoni case has been talked about as well. So you can see Luoni and the Minister of Works and Development in the High Court in Hamilton. Let me click on that one. And then you can see that there's a PDF of this case. So this was my great aunt and uncle. It was a land law case from a while ago. Okay. So two ways to use NZLA. If you know the court and the year, you can navigate to it just by following the hyperlinks. Or if you know the person involved, you can search for their name as well. And if I go back a couple of steps and back to the home page, I can also show you all of the rest of the information that's on NZLA. So under all databases, on the right-hand side is my list of all the courts and tribunals and authorities where there is material on NZLA. And you can see that there's a big long list. It's in 2 separate alphabetical lists. I'm not sure why there are 2 separate lists, but there are. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that there are New Zealand acts, repealed acts. Acts is enacted. So an enacted act is as it was the first day that Parliament made the act. And then over time, acts get changed. The ones that I use most often here in my research are the acts as enacted. I also look at the bills quite frequently, and sometimes the historic SOPs, but not so much. NZLA is also the place where you'll find the provincial ordinances. So when European settlement first came to Aotearoa, the Brits set up provinces. It's a bit funny to think about New Zealand now having all these little provincial governments when we're, only just over 5 million people, but they did. They started off with, I don't want to say 6 and ended up with 11, but those numbers might not be wrong. But anyway, each of those provinces made their own legislation in the really short period of time they were around. And you can find that on NZLA and also law journals, including most of the university law reviews, and then some law reform materials as well. So NZLA is always a place that I like to come and check out if I'm like, oh, I can't find it on a Google search. I can't find it in any other places. I think I might find it. Might just come and see if it's digitized here and accessible for me as well. So I know that the thing that I got asked most back when I worked at Christchurch City Libraries was actually trying to answer people's legal questions. It's really tricky and it's really emotive. And often I know in public libraries, people, they want you to give them the answer. We can't, because the legislation tells us we can't give them legal advice, but we can help them find either the legislation or relevant cases, as I've just shown you, or direct them to sources that might have the answer to help them solve their problem. One of those that is freely accessible online is the Community Law Manual. And here's my tab. The Community Law Manual has been published by Community Law, who do a lot of work to make legal help available through Aotearoa. They have branches in most cities and some towns as well, and there's oodles on their website, including this law manual. The thing I really like about the law manual is that once you find it by Googling it or clicking on the link, you can just choose the topic that best meets your question. For example, criminal and traffic law, and then perhaps driving and traffic law. And often I just find clicking through the link, seeing if what's relevant is often the best way to help to answer the types of questions I've got. And then, for example, general driving offences. And then let me scroll down. Tells me in pretty simple plain English what the law is. So this one says to drive a vehicle on the road, you must have a current licence. And it's offence to drive with an expired licence without appropriate tyre or appropriate type. Tells you what the ticket or fine might be, and also links us to the legislation on legislationgovnz to tell us what the law says. So the community law manuals, the plain English written for the public, not in a whole lot of lawyer legalese, but with links to tell us, for example, the regulations schedule 1, and then that link will take me through to legislationgovnz, and when I click on the link there, I can scroll down and see the specifics. So demerit points, suspension of driver's licenses, etc., etc. So the community law manual is amazing, really helpful in terms of answering those basic questions. But you can refer people to community law. I know when I worked in Central Library here in Christchurch, we used to have the community law cards to hand out to people, so they had an immediate, tangible follow-up task. But they're also, you can Google them, and they're super easy to find online and contact as well. So I've purposely kept today really simple. I've talked about the different types of legal sources that there are in Aotearoa, that there are primary sources, which is the law itself, and that's really legislation, also known as statutes and acts, and secondary legislation, and cases as well. So cases, judgments, judicial decisions, and how you can find those two sources available online. There's also secondary sources, so there are books and journal articles and encyclopedias as well. And I've shown you the community law manual really as a place to hopefully answer most questions you might get in a public library about solving people's legal questions. So I made sure I've left lots of time for questions. So that's all the content I hope to cover. The recording is going to be on the LIANZA YouTube channel soon. But there's also two books that if you're keen on legal research or you want to know more from what I've shown you today, that I'd really encourage you to read. One is Mary Rose Russell's book called Legal Research in New Zealand. It has a yellow cover. And one is by Margaret Greville, Scott Davidson and Richard Scragg called Legal Research and Writing in New Zealand. It's got a pile of law books on the cover. Mary Rose Russell's book is an updated version of the Greville book. However, I find they've got two different purposes. Mary Rose Russell really talks about the process of legal research, how to undertake legal research, and what steps you might take. Whereas the Margaret Greville book is really good around, for me, around what legal publications exist and how you can use them. And it was written really in a pre-electronic time. So most of the material, legal material that used to be in print is now available online. So often the way that Margaret, Scott and Richard have described things, it still applies to how it is online. And actually of the two, it's the earlier one that I use the most, often because I'm trying to work out what something was called and how to find something specific. So I guess my question for you is, do you have questions for me? So either about what I've covered today, about legal research, how to answer a tricky question, what I do every day. Yeah, so I think we've got about 20 minutes or longer. I don't have to rush off. If you'd like to either ask your questions or pop them in the chat and we can go from there. Cool. Awesome. I see someone said citations would be good. All right, Anna, maybe next year we could do a session on the New Zealand Law Style Guide as my favourite referencing style in New Zealand, mostly because it doesn't have as much punctuation as APA. APA is not my favourite. Yeah.
Hi, does anybody have any questions? We're not a very big group, so happy for you to unmute yourself, or as Amber has just done from Southland District. What did your career path look like to get where you are now, Theresa?
Cool, awesome. So thanks, Amber. So I started out, I actually went to uni at 18 to be a lawyer, but I failed first year law. Like I turned up, I was not first in family, so not the first in my wider extended family to come to uni, but I was definitely the first in my immediate family to come to uni. So I really had no idea what I was doing. So failed first year law, plodded along and got my BA, and pretty much immediately started working at public libraries, in a community library for a couple of years. Then I came and I started my MLIS while I was at Linwood, the old Linwood Community Library. It's sadly it's a casualty of the earthquakes. Then I came back here to UC for a couple of years, covering a few library assistant roles, one maternity leave, one was part-time while I finished my MLIS. And then once I finished MLIS, I went back to public library and took on a role in the Aotearoa Information Centre, and had responsibility in that role for looking after sort of the government law council material. And I was there for about 5 years, I think, with some maternity leave breaks for my 2 kids. And then after all of that, I got this role at UC in 2014, and I have been here ever since. And it's changed a bit since I started. Initially, I was appointed in a kind of junior law librarian role to a senior law librarian, because we no longer have a specific standalone law library at UC. Instead, our law collection and our law service is all part of our main library. So since I was, and then staffing changes in time really mean that I'm now kind of the senior full-time librarian, offering a 1.5 F to law and criminal justice students. So I have 2 amazing colleagues, John Arnold and Kerry Gilmore, that support me to teach legal research and APA and information literacy across the BCJ and LLB here at UC. So have my MLIS, have part of an LLB, maybe a third, maybe, I don't know. I need to get some credit for stuff, so not quite sure where I'm at with that. At some point I'll finish it. So so that's what I do every day, and every day is different. So some days it might be like this, teaching first year law students how really intro stuff. Other days it might be supporting honours or academic students to do quite in-depth research. I don't do research on behalf of people. I don't have the capacity and sometimes not quite the content knowledge to do that kind of research. But I do support like honours and postgrad and academic staff by helping them to kind of define their research and knowing what our collection is and knowing how we have access to material. I do a lot of that. So thanks, good question.
Anybody got any questions they would like to ask while we've got some time? I have a very trite question, which is, what is the weirdest thing you've ever been asked about law in a library, in a public library setting?
Well, the weirdest question I ever got asked was about murders of Jehovah's Witnesses in Brazil. And so I had to explain to my manager, well, someone was looking for a case, and that was all they knew about the case. And so I felt that ultimately I couldn't find it, but I had to report my internet searches to my manager, mostly because I said, if anybody asks, I promise you I'm not plotting anything. This is the question I've been asked. So that's probably the oddest one. And there have been a few times where I've been asked odd things along those lines, where I felt that if somebody didn't know who I was or didn't know what I did, and was just looking at the UC internet logs and saw me searching for murder or crimes, then I should probably be able to justify it. So my manager has told me very clearly I don't need to tell her, but I've said I feel like I do, so you can understand why I'm searching for weird things. So that's probably the weirdest. Michelle, I see you've asked about Hansard. So no, well, kind of. It's complicated. Like all law, what's been digitised and accessible is a bit of a hodgepodge. So for Hansard specifically, the Parliamentary Library in Parliament really made a decision in 2000, from the election in 2002, everything from then on would be online. So for Hansard from 2002 onwards, they're all on the Parliament website. There are some earlier ones, I think from 1987 on Knowledge Basket. And then there are some earlier ones on the Hathy Trust. So I think it's spelled like this, website, and they're a group out of California who are digitizing a whole lot of material. I promised Anna I wouldn't go on too many of my rants, but here is one. So the Parliamentary Library and Parliament have said that the digitisation by the Hathy Trust is acceptable for New Zealand's taonga. I don't think it is. The Hathy Trust, yes, they've digitised individual volumes, but there's no master index to Hansard. So they're actually really hard to search online. So I don't use them online on the Hathy Trust site. We still have them in print. So I tend to use the index, find the print, and then go find the online volume on Hathy Trust and go from there. My hope is that one day they might be digitised in a more accessible way, but not currently. So yeah. I hope that, perfect. Yay, that's all good. Along the same lines, in terms of parliamentary material, pretty much if you're looking at something that Parliament's done since 2002, Parliament's the place to look at. The ADJs have been digitised, which is an amazing piece of work, but only up to 1951. After that, there's a big gap until kind of the early 2010s when individual government departments started putting them online. Yeah, so I guess that's one thing to say, is that we've got a pretty substantial collection here at UC, and I know Christchurch City Libraries does as well, because I've worked with that collection. Oh, thanks, Catherine, for putting up the link. Yeah, so there's lots of material, and my normal go-to really is to Google things, and really is to think about what I'm looking for. I do, as a librarian, sometimes I feel very guilty when I do a lot of Google searching, but sometimes, and by a really good Google search, lots of phrase searching, connecting with ands and ors usually helps me find what I'm looking for and where it might be digitised. Cool.
Oh, thank you.
That's okay.
That was really interesting. I was explaining to Theresa before we came on that my son is a lawyer, so now I might be able to talk similarly intelligently to him, but possibly not. But I found it really interesting, and sort of thinking about civics education and all of those kinds of things, it sort of seems amazing to me that it's not something that we just sort of more generally know about, really, as citizens of a democracy, about where do you find this stuff. So it's wonderful that there are public librarians out there, and also tertiary librarians, etc., who are able to help ordinary citizens like me find stuff that could be really important at certain points in life. So thank you all.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I want to echo that. Like, the thing that I think probably helps me most in this job has been an absolute geek and being really interested in what's happening in Parliament, what's in the news, what's going on in the courts, knowing what's going on has been really helpful. And the amazing Elizabeth McCullum, who is the current NZLLA Vice President, has mentioned, did you want to mention the NZLLA project on accessing free legal resources, or did this session kind of cover it? Haha. Oh, you sent that directly to me. Haha. That's funny. Anyway, yes, ultimately we are hoping to, the NZLLA are hoping to collate this all into one place that members of the public can access through our website, which is nzlla.org.nz. And this is my time, Anna, I'm going to plug the NZLLA. We are an organisation who works to support law librarians and legal information professionals in Aotearoa. We have an amazing group of colleagues who get together and do a lot of professional development work and share knowledge, share resources, and talk together as well. So if you're working with legal information, we would love to have you join us, and we do lots of things with LIANZA, and I hope this is the start maybe of some more kind of legal information sessions, because Anna, you're right, civics education is really important, and understanding how democracy and government and the courts work is really important.
Indeed it is. Thank you. Yes, it's one of the LIANZA's working on a submission at the moment for the Future for Local Government review, and that's one of the areas, focus areas is around democracy. So speaking quite strongly to the role of libraries in that space, the work that's already being done, and how it could be built on for the, strengthened for the future. Yeah. So thank you so much, Theresa and NZLLA, for enabling the session to go ahead, and thank you so much everybody for attending. I know it's getting to that mad time of year where we all feel like we haven't got enough time, because we don't, and I really appreciate you coming along today to attend, and the recording will be up if you want to share it with colleagues. So thank you so much, and we'll just close with a karakia, and then you can get back to the afternoon, have a cup of tea. So unuhia ki te uru tapanui, kia wātea, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takatā. Koia rā I rongo, whakairea aki ki runga, kia tina, huie, tai kie.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Take care, and please get in touch if I can ever help. My contact details are on my PowerPoint, and yeah, take care.